Cedric from Baltimore, Maryland. Although I'm only 17 years old, I've recently discovered the work of Gino Hernandez. Had it not been for his death, do you think he could have been a star in WWE? Also, could you give your opinion on his death if you haven't done so already? I have talked about Gino on the show before. I'll talk about it again here. Gino Hernandez is one of the great what-if stories in wrestling. And he was before my time and also in a completely different territory. But I've watched his work and his promos. I've learned about him since then. Gary Hart, before he passed away, in his book, I know he talked a lot. He was very close with Gino. Couldn't even look at a picture of him after he died. It was just too much for him to bear. So I've become familiar with him, and by all accounts of people who knew him, of people who were fans of that territory back then and were familiar with his work, he is one of the great what-if stories. Again, I didn't have World Class when I was a kid. I didn't have access to it here in New York, I don't think. But you can find a bunch of his stuff on YouTube. If you've not seen his work, if you're not really familiar with him, go on YouTube. This guy had every attribute that you could want in a pro wrestler if you were a promoter. He had the look, he could wrestle, he could run his mouth. He was real big in that world-class territory. Could he have been big in WWE? I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Jose Lothario. Jose Lothario passed away this week. He trained Gino Hernandez. The same man who trained Shawn Michaels trained Gino Hernandez. WWE was the land of the giants back then. Fat guys, roided up monsters, and they had literal giants. They had all kinds of people, but they were all mostly big or jacked. And those are the people who were more prominently featured. And yeah, you'd have a guy in there like a Tito Santana or somebody like that. Roddy Piper wasn't particularly jacked, although I'm sure he was on all kinds of shit. But Roddy was a special case in that he could talk. He could run his mouth, and so he did well. And I mean, Randy Savage would be another one. Not a terribly big guy, but he had a unique look, and he could talk. So those guys were able to get over. And Gino could talk too. So I can't say for sure if he came in, he wouldn't have done well because he wasn't a giant or anything like that. Had he come in, maybe as part of a tag team, like Bret Hart did, like Shawn Michaels did, eventually he could have branched off on his own, then yeah, maybe he could have been a big deal. Those guys went on to become big deals, and I don't see why this guy couldn't have done the same thing. On his own, back then, in the mid-'80s, we're talking like the early to mid part of the 1980s, I have my doubts. I have my doubts about how really big he could have gotten. I think he may have been a better fit in the NWA. Maybe I could see him as a four horseman. Right? I mean, am I the only one who feels that way? I think Gino Hernandez would have fit right in there. Would have fit in better than Paul Roma or Sid or some of the people who ended up in the Horsemen or Mongo. But I could see that. As far as his death goes, he died very young. He was in his late 20s. He died of a cocaine overdose. There are a lot of wrestlers who do not believe that Gino Hernandez died of an overdose. They believe he was murdered. Michael Hayes has spoken openly about this. In fact, when they used to do those old Legends shows, Legends of the Ring or whatever it was called, Legends Table, Round Table, whatever, which I think they should bring back, by the way. I wish they would bring those shows back. He talked about this on one of the episodes. He does not believe that Gino killed himself or accidentally overdosed. He thinks that he was murdered. And Jake Roberts is another person in shoot interviews who has also said that he doesn't believe that Gino died of an overdose. They think he ended up hanging out with the wrong crowd. He pissed off the wrong people, drug dealers, I presume, and that they killed him. And I guess maybe they staged it to, look like an overdose. We'll never know for sure. We'll never know for sure. I'll take the medical examiner at his word and say that it was an overdose because that's what all the evidence pointed to. He was heavy into cocaine. Everybody who knew him said he had a very big drug problem. And a lot of guys in the 80s were big into cocaine, but Gino more so than most. From everything I've read, everything I've heard about the guy, wherever he would have landed, though, I think he would have had a lot more success than he did. And, if he was able to keep his drug habit in check, maybe had he not died when he did, the drugs would have ended up consuming him anyway. he could have flamed out early from that. But he had all the potential in the world to be one of the all-time great heels.